So hello everyone, welcome to the Georgetown University Wargaming Society's webinar series. Just want to start off tonight with some logistical details. First, if you haven't already, please be sure to mute your speaker and also turn off your video while the speaker is talking. And if you can for the duration of the webinar, that would be great. This does help us conserve our bandwidth as we do the recording that we then post to YouTube. If you happen to have a question, please feel free to enter them in the chat box. I'm going to be keeping track of everyone's questions. And Maurice has said that he will take questions after his presentation concludes. So I will be keeping track of all of them, and I will make sure that they get asked at the end. And just a friendly reminder, this webinar is going to be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube page. And lastly, I just wanted to highlight some of our other upcoming webinars. Next week, July 14th, from 6 to 8 p.m., we are hosting a webinar, Wargaming and Design Thinking with Una Wong. On July 20th, from 6 to 8 p.m., we are hosting a webinar called Operational Energy in Wargaming with Dr. Dominic Wright. And on July 28th, from 6 to 8 p.m., we are hosting Serious Games for Humanitarian Training. All of the links to register can be found on our website, guwargaming.org, and I will put that link in the chat so you can find all of our upcoming events and register if you're interested. And with that, we will go ahead and get started with our main event. We are incredibly excited to have Maurice Suckling joining us tonight for this webinar. He's going to present for roughly 60 minutes, and then we will field questions from the chat. Just to give you some background, Maurice's first game was Driver in 1999. Since then, he's worked on over 50 published video games, including Killing Floor 2, Borderlands the Pre-Sequel, Mafia 3, Civ 6, and the Wii Fit series. He's worked as a producer, a designer, and a voice director, but most often as a writer. Between 2013 and 2015, he was narrative director at 2K Australia. He is also a published board game designer. His games include war games such as Freeman's Farm, 1777, and Chancellorsville, 1863. Outside of games, he works in TV and fiction, co-writing alpha blocks for BBC TV, and publishing a collection of short stories, Photocopies of Heaven. He holds a PhD in creative writing from Newcastle University, England, and a master's degree in global history from Birmingham University, England. He is currently professor of practice at RPI in upstate New York, where he leads the writing concentration program and teaches historical simulations and board games as storytelling systems. His research interests are storytelling in games, board and card games as storytelling systems, history in games, and the history of games. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Maurice.
Thank you, Caitlin. Looks like my screen sharing is disabled. Looks like you need to permit me to do that, and I can bring up the slides.
Just give me 1 second, and I'll get you permissions. All right, see if that works now. If not, I'll pull up the slides for you, and you can just tell me when you'd like the slide to advance.
Looks like it should be working.
Perfect.
Did everyone see that opening slide? I guess I can't see your responses. Great, thank you. Not enough screen real estate here. Okay, thank you very much, Caitlin. Let's get going. So let's see if I can do this. Okay, so I'm going to do this super fast because Caitlin's already basically run through this, but I suppose this serves as a reminder for anyone who's tuned in late as to who it is that's going to be talking at them for the next hour or so. I've just completed 4 years of teaching at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, or RPI, that's in upstate New York. I'm professor of practice, part of the Games and Simulation Arts and Sciences program. That's I'm part of the Communication and Media department. I teach a number of classes specializing in narrative in games and looking at things like storytelling in analog games and historical simulations. As Caitlin mentioned, I have a PhD in creative writing. I did a a dissertation on plot structures. I have a master's in global history, where my dissertation was on the shortest war in history. I'm sure some of you will probably know what that was, and if we were in a real room, I'd be asking for people to throw up hands and see who actually knew this. The war was 38 to 45 minutes long, depending on how you time it, and it was the Anglo-Zanzibar War in 1896. Zanzibar's about there. It's an archipelago of islands off the east coast of Africa, and that is in Guinness Book of Records for the shortest war in history. Anyway, so as Caitlin also said, I come from video games. So Driver was a video game back in 1999. I worked with most of the major publishers over the last 20 or something years, mostly as a writer, sometimes as a producer, sometimes creative director, sometimes a voice director. These games have included most platforms, most genres, and I kind of lost count, but I think it's over 50 now. More recent titles include Borderlands the Pre-Sequel and Killing Floor 2, Civ 6, Planet of the Apes, and consultancy on Fortnite, a game that just came out on Stadia, Lost Words Beyond the Page, and I'm also a voice director for Burden of Command, which is a in-development leadership simulator, tactical war game. I've made contributions to various books on storytelling in games and articles in academic press on things like board games and historiography and things like the Russian famine of 1921. Co-written a book, written for TV, written some short stories, and now have a movie in pre-production on an element of late 18th century Belgian history where people were riding goats summoned by the devil. So Caitlin also mentions Freeman's Farm came out last year. That was published by Worthington, and later certainly later this year, being the full, most likely my next title, Chancellorsville 1863, will be out, and next month Worthington will be launching a Kickstarter for my next title, which is a brand new system that'll be called Hidden Strike American Revolution. So I'm going to break this talk into 4 sections for you. It's pretty straightforward. An introduction, I want to talk about how storytelling can be useful for wargame designers, then how wargame design can be useful for storytellers, and then just the conclusion. So storytelling is something that we might define lots of different ways. We could define this. One definition might be an activity of directed linear authorial intent. Wargame design, lots of different definitions for this available too, but one possible way of defining it would be the creation of game systems informed by history, geography, military science, amongst other disciplines, predicated on probabilities, indeed requiring player agency to determine multi-linear outcomes. And when we define them like this, these 2 disciplines can appear like utterly different constellations that really have nothing to do with each other. One is either a storyteller or a wargame designer, or perhaps does both these things, but it's difficult to see how they relate. So therefore, that's the end of the talk. Or another way of looking at it is that, well, all games tell stories, so therefore all war games tell stories, and there's not much more else, not much else that we can add to this. That war games and stories all have this sort of shape of this beginning and a middle and an end, and there's not much space to move beyond this sort of broad categorization. In which case, that's also the end. They're the same thing, right? That either they have nothing to do with each other, or they're basically the same sort of thing, and there's nothing else to say, and then I'll take questions. But I'm going to suggest to you that there's another way we can look at this instead of these sort of 2 ends of that spectrum. I'm going to suggest that interactive fiction and video game writing and narrative-focused analog games, they're giving us ways of thinking about narrative that go beyond just directed linear authorial intent. We could also consider storytelling from non-Western perspectives. Things like Aboriginal storytelling traditions, where we have an audience who don't just sit and receive a story, they actually actively participate in the story, contributing to it and shaping where this story ends up. And that moves our perception of storytelling as this directed linear authorial intent. And storytelling in games can often be about the creation of narrative systems that invite, indeed require player agency to determine outcomes. So I'm suggesting there are parallels between what a narrative designer does, certainly in the video game world, and what a wargame designer does with the creation of playable systems with circumscribed moments of agency. And hopefully you can see there that we're moving away from this position of these two extreme ends of a spectrum. Marco Arnaudo wrote this book, I think it was about 2 years ago. You might know him as Marco Wargamer, as he was, now Marco Omnigamer on YouTube, a very popular and well-regarded board game review channel. And with this book, he starts to try and help us find a way of picking through some methodology of thinking in a more detailed way about this intersect between storytelling and wargame design. He suggests using Onega and Lander's definition of story as the semiotic representations of a series of events meaningfully connected in a temporal and causal way. This is fairly early on in the book. He comes to tell us this, and he's starting to suggest that wargames demonstrate prominent representational components and significant narrative content. But in his mind, they're not sufficient for us to think about them as things that tell stories, at least not stories of the same kind that we encounter in novels and movies. And I think that Arnaudo's thinking is nuanced and supported by the likes of Seymour Chapman, a highly regarded narratologist. But principally, in Arnaudo's mind, the distinction is through the absence of individual characters in wargames as the ludic lens through which players engage and exploit the game system. So I guess, in wargames, we're accustomed to thinking about perhaps skirmish level games, 10, 20 characters, but they're still a collection of individuals. They're not just individuals. And I think when combat comes down to just one-on-one, we generally think about that as being perhaps more like an RPG game, a role-playing game. Not necessarily, but I think that Arnaudo's not trying to close this debate down. He's really just beginning the debate, and I think that he's onto something with the way in which wargames generally don't use the individual as a ludic lens to exploit and explore what it is that they're covering. At which point you might say, well, okay, but who cares? And to some extent, I'm with you. These attempts at definitive definitions can be rabbit holes and don't really lead us anywhere. And I have some sympathy with that. I do feel that it's important that scholarship doesn't lag too far behind hobbyists. So what I mean by that is if hobbyists can generally agree that a game like The Grizzled, a game like Legion of Honor, Washington's War, and Fog of War are not all the same kind of game. They're not all comfortably described by people as simply war games. People feel that, well, The Grizzled is a game that has war as a theme, but isn't really a war game. And that Legion of Honor is a game that's really a role-playing game that happens to use history as the thematic setting. My point is, if hobbyists can generally agree that this is the case, then scholars can't be too far behind and simply see these as all war games. We should be looking to scholars to try and help us pick through why and how are these games different. And I think that Arnaudo's thinking helps us start to pick away at that idea. There's a lot more that could be said about methodology. I don't really want to go down into that pit, really. It doesn't seem like the right kind of audience for that anyway, but I just want to flag it as being an area that I think is a useful trajectory to kind of go into this discussion. Anyway, for the main section here, storytelling for wargame designers, there are 4 points I want to make. One about tone and theme, one about where to start, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and reversals and revelations. So my opinion about a theme is it's not just a topic. Nazis, for example, isn't just a theme. That's just a topic. For it to really be a theme, at least when I consider the writing of it, you need to take a viewpoint on that theme. Nazis are bad is a theme. Nazis is just a topic. And I'm going to suggest that any wargame is, consciously or otherwise, an historiographic expression. So what I mean by that is, if you are ascribing a unit a value of 2 and another unit a value of 1, that's a decision that is expressing your view on history, on the relative values, combat worthiness, if you like, of those particular troops. You might say, well, I'm just expressing the fact there's twice as many men as there are in this unit as there are in that unit, in which case, well, that's also an expression that you think that there's a 1-to-1 ratio of equivalence between the combat worthiness of those particular troops. And this goes right the way through every aspect of the game, whether you're aware of it or not, whether it's coherent or not, right the way up to the final balance of the game. If you make a game like, for example, Lincoln, and you decide your game is set in American Civil War, and you're going to make it such that it's easier for the Confederates to win sooner, but harder for them to win later in the war, and the inverse is the case for the Union. Well, that's a view that's largely in line with the broad consensus of military historians. But that balance in the game is an historiographic viewpoint. That's an expression of how you see the history and the relevance of the military historical detail that you've picked out. And in game design, expressions, creation and retention of tone and theme are always interdisciplinary efforts. So everything is contributing. It's not just what the designer puts down in the rules, of course. It's what's on the board, how the board is designed, how the cards are designed, how the box art is presented. All of these are telling us information, opportunities to be coherent about the kind of tone and theme that you're wishing to express. Obviously, in conventional analog games, there are fewer opportunities there are in digital form. We generally don't have sound effects and music and animation, at least in most conventional board games. Of course, hybrid games are changing that to some extent, a mix of digital and analog games. And just because you have, say you have a coherent historiographic expression, doesn't mean that you've been able to convey it. It doesn't mean that someone has actually understood the game in the way that you had actually intended. It could be that you absolutely intended for the Union to be a far more powerful force in your game, but someone's played the game 12 times and simply has never ever won as the Union. In which case, well, is that bad design? Possibly, but it could be that someone is simply just playing it wrong and is a bad player. So this is problematic in terms of how we ascribe definitive views on what it is that a game is actually trying to say. Better to talk in terms of a tendency of a game to mean something rather than definitive interpretations that it absolutely means this, that, or the other. Begin at the beginning and go on till you come to the end, then stop. This is the advice of the king, who I think the caterpillar in Alice in Wonderland, when asked, well, how do I tell the story? Where do I begin? So in some sense, well, the answer is, well, you begin at the beginning, right? It's simple as that. Go on till you reach the end and then stop. Unless, of course, you begin in the middle, in media res, where things are climactic, where there's something dramatic happening. There's already a starfighter that's being attacked by the Empire or whatever it is. These are examples of where stories start in media res. Then again, to make meaningful choices, we need this dramatic crisis to be framed. It needs to be contextualized. If you don't understand what's happening, the choice might have been interesting and climactic had you understood the choice that you're actually making. But if that's not clear, it's simply a random thing. There's lots of drama, but you can't make any sense of it. So it's hard to know exactly when and where to begin. The case in point would be, for example, let's take Chancellorsville. Do you start May 4th, 5th, 6th? Absolutely, this is Chancellorsville. You'll recognize this as a player, as a historian. You'll understand what's happening, and you'll say, yes, there we are, that's Chancellorsville. You might decide, well, that's much too late for it to be interesting, certainly for the Union, where mistakes have already been made. Well, perhaps I should come back a bit then and start a bit sooner. This is far too near the end. So you might start a few days sooner, a couple of days sooner, and decide, well, you know what, actually that's still too late. The Union still haven't really got any interesting choices to make. The mistakes have already been made. Let's jump back. May 2nd. We get Jackson's flank march, but again, doesn't seem an awful lot of fun to be the Union there. So let's maybe jump back to the 1st, when Lee is starting to move his forces across to the west. Then you might say, look, you know, all of that is still way too late. Let's begin in April, where players have really interesting choices to make, big decisions to make. Problem with that, of course, is it doesn't necessarily really look or feel like Chancellorsville to your intended audience, who might say, sure, I mean, why not just play a grand high-level strategy game? I wanted an operational game about the campaign, and you sort of disconnected them too much. So in my own game, I kind of split the difference and moved to around about 27th of April, when Hooker is on the march and Lee knows that things are transpiring, and he's beginning to think about perhaps he needs to move these troops across. But I left the player to make those decisions. In this game, as Hooker, you don't have to come around to the Confederates' left flank. You might, in fact, push through Confederate right flank. You might go through the middle. So I left those. To me, those were interesting choices, and I left them in the lap of the player. You can see this is an earlier prototype of the board that focuses the action here, and at this kind of time scale, late enough on in the campaign that it's taking some shape. Hooker's moved south, but early enough that everyone still has choices to make that are worthwhile. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So Aristotle, in his Poetics, gave us this idea of thinking about stories as having a beginning, a middle, and an end. Something that when I was an undergraduate just felt like an obvious platitude, and it didn't really register with me at the time. But ever since then, certainly the last 10 years or so, I've really come to think more clearly about what he was saying and how helpful it is, really. This gives us a way of thinking about story as a three-part dialectic, where we have an introduction of an idea represented often by a protagonist. Usually we have the establishment of a status quo at the beginning of the story. This leads to a presentation or development of an opposing idea, normally represented by an antagonist. And this conflict of this idea and this antithesis or antithesis results in conflict. And as a result of that conflict, we get this new state of affairs. We get this synthesis, something that couldn't have happened were it not for that conflict. And thinking about story in this way, and therefore taking that thinking into game design, I think can be a useful tool for keeping clear goals of what it is you're trying to do with your game and your system. So you don't get too lost in the weeds in what you're trying to do. It helps you try and think clearly about what are the ideas that I'm interested in. Am I interested in the idea of Hooker trying to go around Lee's left? And then how would Lee respond? Let's find out. That's a question that if you're clear about, it will help you figure out what scale to come in at in terms of where to start, but also the geographic scale that you're planning to work with as well. Reversals and revelations. So also from Aristotle's Poetics, and also immensely helpful, he tells us there are two main ways in which audiences engage with a story and their attention is retained in the story: reversals and revelations. He defines a reversal as a change from one state of affairs to its opposite, and a revelation, or sometimes translated as a discovery, is a change from ignorance to knowledge. These, I think, are invaluable tools for a writer. You really can't write an interesting story without them. But I'm going to suggest that they're also useful tools, in fact, invaluable tools for game designers, wargame designers. This really leads us into pacing, like how soon, how long, where do I put my reversals, where do I put my revelations, because this is how audiences stay interested. Obviously, there's a danger of being too hard too soon, which is something designers are aware of, but nevertheless good to be reminded of. And also the problem of runaway winners. How do you address that? In video games, we have in racing games, we call it rubber banding. So if the AI car is getting too far ahead of you, the game system itself will actually start pulling that car back. It'll stop it getting too far away too soon so that you can't possibly win. It'll be, you can still lose if you're terrible, but the technique allows you to feel like you're competitive for longer, which therefore is more fun. And I think this is something that isn't just relevant to racing games in video game world. I think it's also relevant to analog game designers as well. Cards, card-driven games, games that integrate card designs in a complex way in the analog games are incredibly useful for this. Introducing new rules that don't ask too much of a player to look through a deep manual of rules, but rules that are essentially come about by process of playing the card, which might be, in the case of this particular card, is from a game called Quartermaster General 1914, and it's a ongoing status change. It changes the environment. It means that your attacks are more likely to be more devastating. It tends to be the case in that game that they're more devastating against the Western allies because they tend to have more prepared cards, and that's actually highly suitable given that mustard gas was used more often on the Western front than it was in the Eastern front. But anyway, these games, card games, give us ways of delivering reversals, delivering revelations in this way. I'm also going to mention a game called Napoleon's Triumph, from about 2007 by Rachel Simmons, which isn't a card-driven game, but it's just another way it shows you of flipping these reversals. This is a game about the Battle of Austerlitz. And in it, the Allies must take a certain number of objectives by the French lines. But if at a certain point the French decide they want to call on a discretionary additional 2 corps, they can access those 2 corps, they can get those troops, but now the situation has changed because now they must take a certain number of objectives behind the Allied lines. This is a neat way of encapsulating this idea of a reversal. It's both a reversal and a revelation. You get the reveal of the additional troops, but it reverses the winning objectives. Extremely useful technique for engaging your audience. And as an extended example, I want to talk a little bit about Chancellorsville 1863, because I think it's a good demonstration of what I mean about how thinking about your design from a theatrical perspective can be immensely useful. So bear with me, it just takes a little bit of time for me to explain my way through this game and get to the point I want to make. But so in this game, there are very few pieces, just 5 Confederate pieces, which at this scale are divisions. Confederate divisions generally much larger than the Union divisions, and 7 Union pieces, which in this case are corps. So hardly any pieces to move, which was the scale I wanted to approach this at. And each formation has what's called here in this game a cohesion rating. It starts at 14 and it moves down to 0. Very, very rarely does it ever go up. So this cohesion value is a numerical representation of a unit's overall combat effectiveness. You can think of it as a combination of things like the troops, number of troops, the morale, the stamina, the equipment, and experience. It's one unified value for ease of play and to concentrate the design lens on maneuver and high-level strategies, which is what this game was targeting. And each of these formations has a certain number of activation cards, which are given to each player. There's a deck of activation cards for each player. And they start the game with a hand of 3 from 15. So the game is only 15 turns long, 15 for each player. And on these cards, so these activation cards you can see top right, show which units you can move, which formations you can move. They also show that square, that black square at the bottom is a currency. This is a momentum cube currency. So Howard and Slocum, that's going to give you one momentum cube. And what you do with these momentum cubes is you optionally choose to buy tactics cards, which allow you to deliver certain kinds of revelations or reversals that change the state of the game, either an ongoing effect, which is rare, there are very few of those in the deck, or more often a one-off event that allows you to do something dramatic and hopefully interesting and perhaps even powerful. It just depends on playing it at the right time. And each time you move a formation, there's also a cost. It costs you one cohesion point. You'll play the card, you'll get a momentum cube, and you go down from 14 to 13. And that's before you've even done anything. So there's always a cost. The idea being here that even troops who march happily into battle, they become tired. Troops riding a wave of a land can't evade hunger or the need to sleep indefinitely. Campaigns take a toll on formations so long as those formations are put to any task. That's the basic thinking behind that. So with this concept of cohesion, formations degrade with use. There's also an additional design benefit. This ramps games up to an end state. This naturally means that you will have formations in play that the more you're using them, the more fragile they're becoming. This is a good way of keeping drama moving in the direction that you want. There's also some thinking here, which is that formations are not only destroyed by dint of them being attacked by the enemy, they're also destroyed by dint of their own offensive endeavors. This seems particularly true of something like the American Civil War. So, as you would expect, you might find that your troops move in such a way that they move into combat with the enemy. And this is about rolling dice. So you roll a certain number of dice, maybe 4 or 5, possibly higher or low, depending on just 1 or 2 modifiers, not a big list, a very restricted number of modifiers. And then players, the attackers, check the results and they roll these dice. And you can see you're after double 6s, the defender's going to lose 2 cohesion points. Double 4s, double 5s are also pretty good. A single 3 is not actually bad. You'll gain 1 momentum cube. And double 1s and double 2s you want to avoid. But here's the thing, you can re-roll, and you can effectively re-roll indefinitely until you destroy yourself if you so wish. Let me back up a bit and try and explain this before I go into a little bit more about this. I've played a lot of war games from a young age, and I've often found, strangely, that combat resolution is often not that much fun, certainly not as much fun as I feel like it ought to be. We have combat results tables where we've got odds and fractions, maybe we round up or round down. We've got long modifier lists, and you need to check the math, you need to recheck it. It gets messy, it's poorly paced as an experience, often. I'm not suggesting this is always the case for everyone, but in my own experience, this is frequently what I felt. This is a shame because this moment of combat resolution ought to be the apex of a war game, a dramatic, tightly orchestrated moment that could be representational of the historical elements, and yet at the same time also be fun. So we know that dice rolling can be fun. Yahtzee, Yacht, which basically gave us Yahtzee, King of Tokyo. And of course, going back into the ancient world, dice rolling is a thing that humans have engaged in a lot. So I felt happy enough to take on the idea of reusing dice. But I also felt that there were a couple of things I needed to do. One was to reduce the number of modifiers so that there wasn't a long list. It helps clarify the design lens, again, what it is I'm trying to do. It helps you be clear about certain objectives that you might take, certain ways you might approach the game. And I also wanted to reduce the cognitive distance between a role and its meaning. So this was about rolling the dice and knowing as soon as possible what they meant, or that moment of drama would be dissipated. There's a real case here for saying, well, let's use custom dice because it reduces that cognitive gap even more. It shrinks that down. So I'm suggesting that this critical moment in gameplay needed to be theatrical in construction and work like a punchline. I wanted it to hit you and you to understand it. rather than feeling like a potentially good punchline once you cross-check references and you double-check some modifiers, you've gone through the list again, and then you make sure, and then, well, you know what, by then, it's not that funny anymore. Not that necessarily it's funny, but you take the point I'm trying to make. It was about pacing and trying to keep this pacing theatrical in frame. The way I framed it was immensely helpful to the way that this experience by the players. Now, of course, this moment of climax in combat between many hundreds of troops, again, depending on your scale, is often not just one moment. It's often talked about as being an ebb and flow lasting many minutes. There's a tension to the build-up of that apex. This is a good thing, because if we can get players involved in that drama, make them center stage in it, we can get more out of that tension, more out of that build-up. So that was at the conceptual heart of what games writing and narrative design is really about, and how I wanted to apply it to this particular game design. Those of you who played Freeman's Farm will know that will recognize it. It's essentially the same system with a few modifications. Making re-rolling central to the combat resolution was a way to capture some of that thinking. Offering re-rolling, I could neatly represent the tactical choice commanders made between pushing an attack or relenting. Pushing an attack would always incur losses. Perhaps pushing a unit closer to implosion might prove to be the best call. It might be just the risk you have to take at that time. But throughout it all, the player would be at the center of this drama, difficult choices. So this system isn't just are you lucky or not. I would contest that it's just a dice fest. Yes, there's plenty of dice involved, not lots and lots, but sometimes you can be getting up to perhaps 7 or 8 dice. But I don't think it's just about, are you a good dice roller? Are you lucky? It's really about how you respond to the rolls. You use your momentum cubes to re-roll, so you'll get these momentum cubes, and you can buy tactics cards, and they have varying prices. The other thing you can do with those momentum cubes is, well, you can use 3 of them to re-roll. You've got a decision to make. Do you burn them on the cards, which is super useful, or do you burn them on that roll because you've got 2 1s and that's a disaster for you? You might not spend the momentum cubes even if you have them on a reroll. You might decide you're going to reduce your cohesion level. Again, you're going to come down from 14 to 13, go from 14 to 13 when you first move, but maybe you decide, you know what, I'm going to go again. I don't like this roll, and you burn more cohesion points. Again, it's a question of, are you going to cut your losses, or are you going to gain advantage, cut your losses and stop the attack now, or do you think, well, I can gain advantage later, I'll come back to this. Perhaps I can get better modifiers later on. Yeah, and you're also trying to balance your observation of the tactics tableau, which is cycling as well. It's dynamically rotating and moving as you're playing. That's to do with my reading of commanders talking about how in combat, they often feel like there are these windows of opportunity that pass them by, they present themselves and then pass them by. And so I wanted to represent that by the tactics tableau rotating around. So if you don't buy a card, it disappears into the discards and a new card appears kind of on a conveyor belt. But you always have an opportunity to at least one chance to buy a card, which you might not have the momentum cubes at that time because you might have already burnt them on rerolls. So this is really about this interesting decision, which is, do you stop or do you keep going? And that decision is facilitated by the system, but not dictated to players by the system. The player is in charge of that choice. This was a way to try to reclaim combat resolution as a moment of drama, a moment of key revelation, at least what the dice result means. That's the revelation. If not, also a moment of reversal as well. I thought I was losing, but now I'm not, or I thought I was winning, but now I'm not. So I was searching for a way to be experientially appealing. I did people thinking, I hate figuring out the odds. I just went through that. I don't want to do that again. I don't want to go through all the modifiers. You know what? I'll leave it, or, you know what, I'm going to do it because I want to win, so I'm going to bore you to death while I go and do that. I wanted people to think, give me the dice, I want to re-roll, and I understand this was not a good roll quickly, and be excited about the prospect of rolling and engaging in that combat resolution. So yeah, I wanted to conceive of this combat resolution moment as being something that could be representational of some historical truths that I was trying to get at, and also be fun at the same time. How are we doing for time? Okay. So the next part of this is wargame designers for storytellers. There's three things I think that storytellers can take from wargame designers that can be of use to them. Emergent story systems, conflict, and meaningful agency. So we have in video game world sandbox games, these games where open world environments and you can explore them. We have games like, for example, Far Cry, where we have these systems that are talking to each other. So in the code, you might have a flock of hawks. I'm not sure if hawks, the collective noun is for them. Anyway, you might have a flock of birds, which happen to be hawks or some other birds of prey. And they fly around this game world. You might have these small mammals and they run around this game world. And if those birds of prey find those mammals, well, they might just set upon them and attack them and carry them off. This is not stuff that the player is directing. They're not in control of this. This is just systems that are talking to each other and allowing the player to feel like they're in an environment that bears some verisimilitude, that has some kind of representational value to them that they can identify with. These are things that writers, narrative designers, and of course, coders and other people, being a highly interdisciplinary exercise, all are helping to generate. We also get player-directed emergent stories. So these are places where the storyteller learns to say more by telling less. They learn to be a facilitator of potential drama. So instead of thinking about yourself as being someone who's writing the script for a play, you might think of yourself as someone who is setting the stage for a play. You're not going to dictate who does what where, but you are going to put something that looks like a ship on the stage, maybe a piano on a rope that's suspended in midair, maybe a gun and a trapdoor. And you're going to let the participants figure it out for themselves. In truth, you might well be staging these things in such a way that you're inclining them to encounter one, then another, and then another, so that you can try and control some of that experience, but nevertheless, you're not dictating how it definitively must unfold. So these emergent story systems are things that I think could be super useful and relevant for storytellers. Conflicts, well, what could be a better instruction for a storyteller than to consider the centrality of conflict to their art, rather than possibly change? Wargames are by definition engines of conflict. One or more sides are pitted against each other with an uncertain outcome. A story where the outcome is certain will likely fail to retain audience engagement. But an audience might in fact have a good idea what an outcome might be, determined by its genre, but often they don't have a good idea exactly how that outcome will be arrived at. They know probably it's a comedy, so probably things will work out, but they don't know exactly how that's going to transpire, and that's part of the engagement for them. And that uncertainty, the details of the conflict's ultimate resolution is critical. If you don't know, then people are engaged. If they know how it ends, not so much. So with moments of agency, we have, these are obviously highly important to a player. That's where they feel they can influence a game's outcome, and this helps keep them engaged and interested. Choices of units to move, attacks to launch, cards to play, alliances to make or break, and so on. These help engage players. They feel like they've got stuff they can do. But design around agency is more than just a selection of available, meaningful choices. It's also, I think perhaps foremost, about circumscribing the moments of choice within those systems. Designing the space within a game where choices may be enacted. This might not necessarily mean I go, you go. There might, for example, be simultaneous play, or you might take a game like the GMT's Saratoga, where you splice moves. You have an opportunity as the non-phasing player for ranged combat. while someone is moving towards you. And that seems a good way of trying to not miss out on the opportunity of firing at people who are coming towards you. So for a storyteller, this way of circumscribing the space, dictating where it is that the player gets to make choices, is very close to what a narrative designer in video games does. And they allocate that space and says, here is where you can do stuff. When working with dialogue systems, deciding when and where to offer choice is fundamentally circumscribing and therefore highly influencing the actual content. The way you shape that choice is also clearly defining, to some extent, what that actual potential content could be. Equally, designing meaningful agency is not necessarily about the choice to alter a story. It might be the choice provided through the design that permits players the means to experience a predetermined story in a variety of different ways. So again, from video games, games like Her Story or Return of Obra Dinn, both relatively recent, are good examples of this. Here, players can experience dramatic ironies of their own pacing and in their own unique story stitched together sequences, but they can never fundamentally change the details of what characters do with that content or any decisions they make. Instead, players experience a range of interpretations about these actions and decisions, and critically, they experience a sensation of ownership of these interpretations because players have arrived at them, arrived at these this awareness by themselves. So instead of thinking about, well, what choice can I give players, let's frame it in a sort of adventure story. I can choose my character, I can choose my equipment, I can choose my band of adventurers that I go with, and I can decide to go into the mountains or down into the mines, and I could decide to kill the dragon or let the dragon live. Think of it more like a detective story where, look, this story's already happened. Someone has already been killed. And you're not going to change who is killed. You're not going to change who the killer was. But you are going to have the freedom to go about discovering that truth for yourself. And that won't necessarily just be a linear path. You might have lots of options how you go about doing that. So I want to conclude then. I'm going to suggest to you that these two constellations of storytelling and wargame design don't leave us with just nothing to say because, well, wargames are stories, so what's there to say? And don't leave us with just nothing to say because they're so alien to each other that there's no connection. I think there is some connection, and I've tried to explain why I think that is today. I think storytelling may help inform wargame designers. Both need to consider consistency and control of tone and theme. Both need to consider how to frame the scope and opening of the experiences they create for their audience. And both may benefit from working with a broad structure of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Further, both would benefit from understanding the importance of delivering audience engagement, audience engaging reversals and revelations. I spent some time on that because I think it's especially important. Wargame design may help inform storytelling. Both can leverage meaningful experience for the audience through emergent storytelling systems. Both benefit from the centrality of conflict and the uncertainties of its resolution. And both benefit from an understanding of when, where, and how to deliver meaningful agency to audiences within the affordances of their relative mediums. I put a bibliography together. I didn't lean heavily on much of this stuff, but I put it in here because I did touch on it at some point or another. And I'll be happy to take some questions. I didn't answer them as we were going. It's hard for me to keep track of all the various things. I saw some coming in, so I'm happy to take some now.
All right, I have grabbed the current questions from the chat. As we go along, please feel free to continue to drop questions in the chat. I will be monitoring it and I will ask the questions in the order that they have appeared in the chat. So the first question is, do you have a preference for linear authorial storytelling that guides players down a structured story path, or a more sandbox style storytelling where the designer creates a framework for players to create their own stories? If so, why?
Okay, thank you. No, I don't really. I think it's a question of who, as ever, it ultimately comes down to who are you making that story for. So who's your audience, and also this comes back to, this is a lifetime of doing this as a professional, I think, as well. It also comes down to, well, what are the budgets involved, and what resources do you have to handle it? If pushed, I think that it's hard for me to figure out why I would want to restrict player agency. And if I have the option and I see that it's a suitable audience and the topic that I have in mind and the resources permit me, yeah, I would rather make a game that has uh, interesting choices, but that doesn't necessarily mean all the choices. It means figuring out, well, what are the choices that matter, and what can I say by the kinds of choices that I give them. So, you know, I made a game a couple of years ago called Planet of the Apes: Last Frontier, and that was essentially a storytelling game where you made, with a few moments of sort of twitch decision, but mostly it was, what dialogue am I going to choose? And uh, it's a very limited type of agency that we permitted people with that narrative system. We didn't let them collect resources. It wasn't a resource management game, and so it was very limited. But it just was because that's the type of experience that we were trying to deliver. So I don't think that it depends. I'm a big fan of those games that I mentioned, Her Story and Return of Obra Dinn, and I think that we perhaps in video games are a bit guilty of thinking in terms of players must have a choice to do everything when it's not necessarily true. It's more that, well, what choices are in those games. You can't change what's happened, but people have been thrilled to experience it their own different ways and choosing different paths, around, finding their own way to the ending. So I don't particularly, because it depends on the format, but generally speaking, I'd rather push agency towards the player as much as I can within the context of what it is that I'm trying to get them to think about or experience.
Next question. Do you feel as though variability in the combat result, for example, through the use of cards or dice, increases the tension and excitement in the combat resolution, as well as the historical possibilities of the surprise stand of a unit against overwhelming odds?
Yes, in short, yeah. I think it helps keep things interesting. It sort of speaks to what I was talking about with, if you like, that kind of runaway winner problem. Feeling as if, can you still feel like you've got a chance? And uh, I think that this is somewhat why my preference has been for generally designing smaller games, so games that are more like an hour long rather than 5 or 6 hours long, because I think that players permit you those kinds of bigger reversals that you can get by increasing the variety of responses that you can get through rerolls and cards that can modify the game world environment. I think they're more permissive about that than they would be if, well, they were winning for 4 hours and then they got 3 bad rolls and now they're not. But that's also got its own problem of kind of runaway winners. It's just a sort of a slower process of it. So yeah, the answer is yes. I think they absolutely help you deliver those kinds of reversals and revelations.
All right. Up next, would it be possible for you to give a simple example of re-rolling from Chancellorsville?
Yeah, so let's say I'm rolling 4 dice and I get 4 1s. At that stage, I'm going to lose 2 cohesion points. So for sure, I'm going to look at those dice and I'm going to say, well, I'm definitely going to re-roll. Now, if I don't have any momentum cubes, I would need 3 to re-roll. If I don't have any, I'm just going to move my cohesion marker down, which had already started at 14. It moved to 13 when I moved. Then I rolled. Well, I look at those two. I'm going to lose 2 if I do nothing. So I'm definitely going to burn another 1, move it down to 12, and then roll again. And I might just keep rolling and rolling and rolling. But each time I'm rolling, there's some complexities to this because there are major and minor activations, and major activations don't cost you for the second reroll. But just keeping it simple for now, that just means that it's possible for you to just take a formation and to just destroy it by just throwing it at an enemy relentlessly. Tends to be a very bad idea to do that, but there might be some times in which you figure, I shouldn't, this isn't my best opportunity. I've got a great modifier now. The board, I didn't show it for very long, but they're essentially, it's a point-to-point map and arrows connect to them, but as you might expect, that doing something like crossing over a river is more penalizing. So if you cross a river that has red arrowheads, which means that, well, you lose dice. So that they're not as good to attack over. But then there are times in which you can get, the way that the game presents it, that would be a flank attack. So you get additional dice there, and there are other cards that you might have that mean that, all right, I'm throwing 7 dice here and I've got all 1s. Surely I'm going to re-roll again and I might do far better. And sometimes, of course, what you're really looking for is the position. You're looking to push the enemy formation back. So you need 6s for that. And there are cards that can help you with that. And yeah, so anyway, hopefully that's kind of covers that in enough detail. And let me know if it doesn't, but that sort of basically talks you through a kind of a basic reroll situation.
So our next question is, what are some war games, analog or digital, that you think have the most innovative storytelling systems right now?
Well, I suppose, yeah, that sort of depends on what you think is a war game. So certainly a storytelling system that I've enjoyed a lot would be the Grizzled. I think that's pretty innovative. I think that I've enjoyed the storytelling in Legion of Honor, but I think it's less innovative and certainly less. I don't really think the Grizzled is a war game either, but I don't think that Legion of Honor is really a war game. It's a game themed on history. It's really an RPG game, an analog RPG, where you take a French soldier through a career through the Napoleonic Wars. I have been enjoying some coin games and the storytelling that's baked into that. I probably would cite most of all, I've enjoyed the storytelling in the Quartermaster General series. Very light touches, very light war game. But I don't mean that at all in a derogatory way. I get the sense, particularly the 1914 version, I get the sense of the war, I get the sense of the shape of it. I feel like there's a narrative that's being developed and extracted from that. And ultimately, I love the elegance of it. It's play a card. Ultimately, what you do in your turn is you play a card. A little bit more to it than that sometimes. But that strikes me as being immensely elegant. As you can see, I'm more drawn to those sorts of lighter games in general. Certainly now, having spent a number of years buying those heavier games and setting them up and then packing them away. But so yeah, I think Quartermaster General, probably that story system is a war game that I've admired a lot recently.
Okay, next up, if you playtest your games, what feedback do you look for in playtesting to ensure that your storytelling is on track?
Well, I suppose I'm just looking for anything that I can get. And those of you who've got your games playtested will know that that in itself is no small thing. People either seem to not tell you much, or they tell you stuff that's not particularly helpful to you. It's sort of complimentary and vague sometimes. So I'm really after anything, but if there's particular markers, it's trying to get a sense of was the game, did it feel like it was over much too soon for one player? So did one player sort of cut adrift from it and feel as if there's nothing I can do? And if that's the kind of response that I'm getting, I'm going to be alarmed about that and feel as if it could well be balancing, or it could be more profound. It could be like this system is broken in some more troubling way. But I want players to feel engaged to the end, and this is why I particularly like the system with battle formations games where units degrade the more you use them. So the game naturally has this kind of inbuilt time clock, which means it's going to implode, which not only seems true to life because that's what happened with these formations that were heavily tasked, but also it's a good sort of gameplay paradigm that it's going to force things closer and closer to a dramatic conclusion. I think systems that don't have that, you just need to work harder at trying to make sure that your balancing is intact so that you just keep players engaged and feeling as if I've got some choices. There don't have to be lots of choices, but they need to be enough that they feel as if, okay, that's happened. That's not what I wanted. I rolled badly. Perhaps I'm all out of other options with rerolls, but you know what? There's a tactics card that's just popped up on that tableau, and if I can buy that, I'm still in with a shot. So I like these systems that feel as if the game hasn't disappeared from you too soon. You feel right to the death. You feel as if I think I've still got a shot, and that means that I think people are having fun.
Next question. What are some of your favorite techniques and methods for making players immersed in the story narrative in manual games?
In animal games. Could you just say the question again, please?
Sure. So the question is, what are some of your favorite techniques and methods of making players immersed in the story narrative in manual games?
I like games that have a gentle slope, a gentle introductory slope. So ways of bringing you into this game system gently. Sometimes we have introductory scenarios that help do that. I'm particularly impressed with some designers who are able to. It's hard to do this in war games, but there was a game called Fog of Love came out 2 or 3 years ago, which is essentially a romantic comedy game. You're sort of playing with another person to create this romantic story, and that used a system whereby you open the rules and it says don't read any more rules, set up the game. And in that system, you basically have a deck of cards that you don't shuffle, you just place down. And as you move through the game, learning the game, the cards are structured in such a way that it's teaching you the game as you go. I think this is a really fantastic technique, fantastic approach of sort of bringing you in. There's not this big barrier to entry that, I remember reading Avalon Hill game rules in the 80s, and some of them were hard work to get through, and I didn't feel like I had the energy to actually set the game up, let alone play it by the time I'd finished them. So I like games that are sensitive to this and aware and have it. They can be deep, but I like them when they're sort of hard to master, but easy enough to grasp. I like these approaches where you set up the game with these cards that are teaching you the game as you go.
The next question is, what published wargame by another designer do you wish you had designed because of how well it integrates narrative, reversal, and revelation into play? How and why does it do this so well?
Good question. I already mentioned it, actually. I think Quartermaster General 1914 is a game that I wish I had designed. I think that the simplicity, the simplicity of the ideas, and yet the way in which this lets you do some big things that are not don't take hours to set up, I think is tremendously effective and empowering for the the player. I get a sense of this general sort of flow of how the war is going, and I feel smart because I've got these cards in my hand. I'm going to play this card, and then other player plays something else that made him feel smart. So I think it's just a really elegant system, and I understand it's not for everyone, and it comes in at a certain level which might not be deep enough for many people. But that's a game that I'm deeply impressed with. I haven't played it that much, but I liked Hitler's Reich. That is the GMT game that everyone was complaining about the rules being difficult to get to grips with. But I think there's something really interesting in that system too. I haven't played it enough to be sure how I feel about it, but I think there's something pretty well thought through there, the way that we have this sort of central deck that we're competing for, and you can go through that. You can compete for air superiority at any time. You decide it's essentially like an assault. And I think that there's something I like about that. Yeah, that's probably enough. Actually, I just had a look at Blitzkrieg, that mini 20-minute long World War II game, and I think that I haven't played that enough to know, but I also think, I think there's something pretty neat and fun about the way that game has sort of shrunk that war down into such a manageable size. I think it gives you, you can clearly see how you're progressing. The chip pull system there means that you don't ever really know that you're in control. You can't be 100% certain that you're on top of things, but that's a pretty good system.
All right, and then one final question, at least so far, just to everyone who's still listening in, if you happen to have any saved rounds, feel free to drop them in the chat. So final question, a lot of war games focus on specific stories like World War II and the Civil War. What stories do you wish were more explored in war games?
Well, there's certainly more popular wars, and it's sort of a market question, isn't it? Will the market bear more unusual, more unpopular eras? I'm taking a look at the Boer War right now, the second one, and it's not a particularly popular topic, but something that's interesting to me. I think some of it is also to do with not just war. There are certainly unusual wars, like the quasi-war, the war between the US and the French, or the partial war just after, around the time of the French Revolution, when the French decided that they weren't going to pay the Americans back because it was a different government, and the Americans were rather annoyed about this. So this is an unusual war that I think has some potential. But what I also want to say was that I think there's also something in looking at history beyond just the wars, but also the wars that don't happen. So I'm working on a couple of projects right now, which include diplomatic crises. So the 1911 Agadir crisis, which had Britain and France and Germany almost going to war. That's an interesting opportunity to explore ways in which you prevent war. And in a similar vein, I've been working on a project about the July crisis, the July 1914 crisis, which of course ultimately did lead to World War I, but I'm interested in framing that in a way where players have the opportunity the onus is on them to try and prevent that from escalating into war. So I think that for those of us interested in war games and history, there are also ways of thinking about this that come at not just conventional, conflict, but also, preventing conflict. And finally, just one more thing on that, the Hidden Strike American Revolution game that Worthington will announce next month it's a number of different games in one, but at its heart, it's really a co-op game, with a hidden traitor mode. So this is a co-op war game focused on the American Revolutionary War, but I love war games, but I also love co-op games, and I was like, well, why aren't there more co-op war games, and are there really any? And This seems an interesting topic to me. So it's really about, will you work together to defeat this enemy? Or in fact, one of you is probably, you're not in the traitor mode, you don't know for sure that there's a traitor, there's just a possible traitor. So everyone is suspicious about everyone else. And this seems to me an interesting dynamic to explore in a war game format. So, I mean, I'm definitely interested in trying to find fresh kind of avenues, and that could be unconventional wars. So I mentioned a couple, or it could be thinking about the stuff around wars. The older I've got, the more interested I've become in the stuff around wars, the ending of wars, or the beginning of wars. Or it could be thinking about the ways in which, when we fight a war, does it necessarily mean that it's just the sides are clear? Perhaps we've got some hidden agendas designed into how ostensible allies are working together. Churchill, GMT's Churchill, Mark Herman's Churchill, I think, is a great game in that regard, letting you play with these ideas as all three of you, the Soviets, the British, and the Americans, are allies fighting against the Axis, but it's a semi-co-op. You kind of win, but you don't want to win too much, otherwise you paradoxically kind of lose. So I think there's lots of work can be done in that area of just finding these newer angles, fresher angles that could still be even working in a conventional, the wars that we know very well, World War II and Revolutionary War and the Civil War and so on, but just find fresher avenues into them.
All right, and one final question for you. How do you deal with sensitive topics in some conflicts, like the Opium War or slavery?
Carefully, with caution. I've not designed games on those topics. The Hollandspiel have one on, so Tom Russell has a game on slavery that I've heard very good things about. I believe it's approached things appropriately, but it's a pertinent topic. I've been looking at the Boer War, and it feels to me as if I can't ignore concentration camps. I can't ignore blockhouses and the razing of farmland. That feels as if that would be negligent of me as a designer to pretend that stuff didn't happen. But if I embrace it, to what extent am I celebrating it, or perhaps misrepresenting it in a way that is damning to me as a human? So I think that research it, read around it, think about it. I think that in that case, my two real thoughts about it. One is probably write some design notes about it to make it clearer what it is that you're addressing and why you've addressed it the way that you have. I certainly think that's better than ignoring it. But also, in the case of concentration camps, I'm still early in that game design concept, but I'm thinking about ways in which concentration camps is beneficial to the British ending the war, but also ends up giving the Boers some potential benefits. So, if you know anything about it, you know about Emily Hobhouse coming and sort of investigating what was happening, and that led to the Fawcett Commission, which was pretty damning about what Kitchener was up to, which was an opportunity for the Boers to do some diplomatic work to regain some territory, metaphorically speaking, which meant that Kitchener shut those concentration camps down later on. So I'm trying to figure out how to facilitate those things. I mean, the situation is more complicated than that, of course, because really what was happening is that by responding to the Fawcett Commission and shutting those concentration camps down, it was actually much easier for Kitchener to hunt down the still extant commandos that were there. Those commandos were left then with their wives and children, so they were easier to snare. So in some ways, it looked like the humanitarian thing to do was to shut the camps down, and they were disastrous at the humanitarian level. But later on, some of the diseases had been taken care of. The British started shipping people away to other parts of the world, and So it looked like Kitchener was doing the right thing, but in fact, in some ways you can say, well, it was actually more inhumane for him to not take those people who were the families of these still at large commandos. Anyway, this is a bigger topic and one I'm not really quite equipped to talk about right now. I'm still researching it, but it's a super interesting question, and I think you have to read broadly about it. I think that it's terrible to ignore it, and I think that if you embrace it, you have to try and find ways in which it speaks to a broader truth of not just, fable, meaning that the British win. They also come at a cost. Perhaps there's diplomatic repercussions and so on. So that's stuff I can talk about there. I think that Opium War and slavery are also hugely important topics that I think would be a disaster for them to be simply ignored. But I would approach them with some caution.
All right, I'm just going to take one last pass for any remaining questions from folks.
I saw there was a question about the bibliography, and you've got the slides, Caitlin, so when you post this up, you can just make sure that doesn't get chopped off.
Will do.
Thank you.
And with that, then we will conclude for the evening. Thank you to everyone who attended our webinar this evening, and thank you especially to Maurice for sharing his expertise and his time with us.
Thank you, everyone.